we'll go ahead with the introduction. So we'll have some time for the discussion, which I'm pretty sure is going to be a very vibrant discussion. Give us tremendous honor to have Dr. Michael Saag as our guest at our weekly grand round in pathology. I know many of you know Dr. Saag, and actually many of the population of the US know Dr. Saag, featured on CNN and many stations. Is very popular. It seems like everybody know UAB now through Dr. Saag and Jeannie, so which is great for us. But more importantly, Dr. Saag, history and investment in the institution span 41 years. So he came when he was 10-year old and just stayed. And as you see, you look very young and vibrant. So he served as an associate dean for global health for 16 years, I think, till like a couple of months recently. You probably are still in the role in transition, handing off, and he's a director of our UAB Center for AIDS Research. So he started in University of Louisville, did his MD, and then came for thinking he'll just do a residency and go somewhere else, do fellowships. Well, little did he know that he stayed as a chief resident, as a fellow, as a research fellow, and then 40 more years, 35 more years, and rose through the ranks to the current positions. There is no center that he's not a senior scientist in. Just to name a few: the Center for Aging, Community Health, Virology Program of our Cancer Center, School of Public Health, Palliative and Supportive Care, Exercise Medicine. You name it, Dr. Saag has taken a lead role in one of the best funded investigators in UAB, and clearly because as you remember, if you go back 40 years, we had another pandemic that he was one of the international leading figures in helping us with that pandemic, and did the same when COVID came. He's currently a PI of I believe four grants, including 2 U01s and an R24 and a P30. Trained a lot of fellows, both on the clinical and postdoc space, and his contributions go on and on. 500 publications, over 100 monogram, a book on if some of you want to read about positive, a book about dealing with healthcare and death and all that, and his personality and energy is always contagious. And I had the honor to work with him closely during this pandemic, and he really always had an analogy, always had a positive attitude, and helped us all plow through what was really difficult months. So it's an honor, Mike, to have you, and hope to work with you for years to come.
Great. Thank you so much, George. It's great to be with everybody. I'm going to plow through a bunch of slides. I know everybody knows quite a bit about COVID. So a lot of this is a review with a little focus on some of the depth of where the data come from that gives you your usual rules. So where have we been? Where are we now? Where are we going? I'll finish with maybe some editorial comments about my concerns about the future, just something to think about. We could have discussion. The other way to think about it is it's a tale of two epidemics. It's the worst of times for obvious reasons, but it's the best of times because of how science has buoyed our response. And if we're clever enough and smart enough to embrace the science and trust it, I think we'll all be better for it. And I know people in this audience largely agree with that. Conflict of interest, a couple of grants that are now really almost over that are paid for to the institution from Gilead and Veve. And the goals of this talk is to talk about the mechanisms of STAR and how the mitigation strategies are based on the understanding of transmission, and then to articulate a little bit of how mRNA vaccines work and translate into our use. There's other things we'll talk about, of course. Well, it feels like we're Sisyphus in this because we kind of go through a wave of the virus and the transmission. It gets better, and then we go back and fight it again. And along the way, just to editorialize, we also are fighting ourselves. Our society is ripped apart by this, mostly due to, in my opinion, political persuasion, and we keep having recurrent discussions as the cases flare. So do tempers, and so does controversy about how we respond. And it's been the virus to me is tough enough as a foe, but when we start fighting ourselves, that makes it even more difficult. So let's go to basics. This is Pigpen, who's from Peanuts, those of you who remember Charles Schultz. And I like this cartoon because Pigpen, if you take that cloud around his lower body and feet and just move it up to his head, that to me is what an infected person with COVID looks like. They're breathing virus out into a cloud around them. And if you happen to be in close proximity, and you think about integrating your exposure under a curve, that the longer you're in contact with that cloud, especially close space, indoors, you breathe it in with newer variants that are more able to attach to the ACE2 receptor in the airways, the higher the probability is that you'll be infected. So therefore, if you think about it, if we wear a mask, all of us, that mitigates spread. Why? Because if Pigpen is wearing a mask, then that cloud is reduced by at least 90%. So that's a great mitigation strategy. As we know, a lot of people in our society are anti-mask for reasons I haven't quite figured out. But let's say you're wearing a mask and Pigpen's not, you get some protection, especially if it's an N95 mask, but most of us are wearing regular surgical masks or even cloth masks, and those maybe only protect us 15 to 30% at most. So Pigpen needs to wear a mask, which means that all of us need to wear masks because we don't know necessarily when we're infected. A lot of infection is asymptomatic, and even among symptomatic people, they have a spread. They can be spreading the virus for up to 24 hours prior to the onset of symptoms. So it's a challenge, and masks work. If you want to debate me on that, we'll go offline because it'll bog down, but they work. And to give you an example of this, there's been a lot of controversy about when kids went back to school this year. In July and August, school boards were being inundated with commentary, and they had meetings and all that type of thing. But here are some data from Maricopa and Pima counties in Arizona, that's near Phoenix. And they looked at over 1,000 school systems, about half of which imposed a mask requirement and others didn't. And what they found is that overall, the incidence of outbreaks was higher in the school systems that didn't have mask requirements. And the data are that those that had masks early, that right away that came back to school, there were 8.4% outbreaks. Among those who did it late, 32.5%, and those who didn't do it at all, 59.2% of the schools that did not implement a mask mandate had an outbreak that required them shutting the school down for a period of time. A lot of us in public health were sort of screaming, if you want your kids back in school safely, for goodness sake, protect them. And yet politics intervene, and I won't go into the states that were heavily against masks, but it was a bad policy from a public health perspective, and data sort of support that. But if you just go back to Pigpen, that simple concept tells you that masks work, and that for kids, especially from the kindergarten era age to seventh grade, who are not eligible for vaccines, at least this week, we need to protect them. So what we know about transmission and incubation, I think everyone in this audience knows that they're transmitted the virus through respiratory droplets. It's maybe aerosolized, as Pigpen illustrated, and that there's asymptomatic spread, and it's unknown how common that occurs. My guess is around 25 to 30%. And just before symptoms start, the nasopharynx is loaded with virus. So just breathing gets it out there. Outdoor spaces where air currents disrupt the cloud, that makes sense. You have less transmission. Personally, I was concerned about college football in September when we had this huge spike. Counter arguments, while they're outside, my thought was, yeah, but they're screaming. Screaming, and they're packed together, and the person behind you, if they're Pigpen, will be breathing on you for 3 or 4 hours. We have not seen super spreader events coming out of college football. That doesn't mean that there wasn't transmission there. And maybe the transmission was in the restrooms when people were crowded together at halftime or something. The median incubation period is about 4 to 5 days. It can be shorter. And 97% of those who develop symptoms do so within 11 days, but I think most people become symptomatic, if they are, to become symptomatic earlier. This to me is one of the coolest slides in the presentation, and I've used it now. Suzanne Judd from epidemiology gave it to me. Let me walk you through it, and let's just focus on Alabama. This would have been back in last September. It would have been probably early August, where we had a case rate of 39 per 100,000. We're now down to about 17. In June, we were down to 3 per 100,000. So we're not out of the woods yet, but let's just take Alabama. If you have 10 people in a room, the probability that one of the 10 are infected at that moment in time is 40% when the rates are 39 per 100,000. If you have 25 people in the room, the sort of next gray bar, 1 out of the 25 probability of being infected is 72%. If you have 50 people in a room with that rate, the probability is over 90%. And if you have 100 people in a room, the probability that 1 out of the 100 are infected at that moment in time is nearly 100%. Now contrast that with Vermont, which would have been us back in June, and you can see the probability of a group of 10 is low. And even if you had 100, you're still under 30% probability that 1 out of the 100 are infected. So when we talk about avoiding crowds or avoiding, it really is dependent on the rate of spread in the community at that moment in time. And that's obviously a very dynamic process. And as we'll talk about in a second, Alabama has been up and down just like the rest of the country. And we're not out of the woods yet. One of the things that has come up, as a lot of you have studied, is the notion of a variant. And they're named in the Greek alphabet. They're trying to get away from where they originated, like the UK variant, South Africa, Indian variant, et cetera. So it's alpha, beta, gamma. It's a whole alphabet soup. And viruses, when they replicate, can make mistakes. Coronavirus is a 30,000 base pair virus. It even has it has an enzyme that autocorrects its transcription, sort of a spell check. But even so, with that much replication, billions of viruses a day, a mistake can happen and get through. And if it has a growth advantage based on Darwin, you get an emerging variant if it has a growth advantage. And we were, as you know, overcome with Delta starting back in the early summer. And Sixto and others in pathology have been screening for that with sequencing and done a great job. And it's a great service for us and the state in terms of tracking that for us. And what everyone saw was that going back to June, the orange bar is Delta, and it just basically overwhelmed us. And part of the issue with Delta is that it has more affinity for the ACE2 receptor, therefore is more infectious upon an exposure, whereas being in a room with someone for 10 minutes with the original variant might heavily lead to transmission. Just 1 to 2 minutes and that close contact with the Delta patient could lead to transmission at about the same rate. Here's our data. I updated this morning. We started off doing really well back in May of 2020. And we paid a price. We had lockdown, we had mask mandates, or whatever. We were taking it really seriously, but then the public got tired, fed up with this. You're interfering with my life. You're causing us to make sacrifices, and we shouldn't have to do that. So everything relaxed on Memorial Day, and going into the summer, it picked up. Governor Ivor issued a mask mandate in Alabama around late July, and you can see that it started to have impact going into September. We had the winter, which was god awful, mostly because people tried to get back to normal Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's, and the resultant spike overwhelmed us. You all worked at the hospital, you know it. Then we came out of it mostly, in my opinion, because vaccinations came on the scene in December, and everything got better until out here, and we had another spike this summer. You'll notice that as of today, there seems to be a new spike, but I think that's maybe a reporting error. But I think what's more important here is that while we had a nice decline going up to about a week and a half ago, we've plateaued. So even without this spike, we have not just dropped down. We are plateauing out. So we're not out of the woods just yet. So just pump the brakes a little bit in terms of trying to get back to normal. If we had people getting vaccinated at a higher level, I think we'd be better off. But this is where we are right now. The clinical spectrum, I think everybody knows by now, so I'm going to go quickly through this so we'll have time at the end for questions. But I think this is an important pathogenesis slide that explains why and how we should use treatments the way we do. After initial infection, there is a viremic phase, and that triggers an innate immune response, think interferon. And in most people, the virus is pretty much under control by day 6 or 7. Now, after that comes an adaptive immune response such that by day 14 to 18, antibodies are produced to a reasonable degree, and the T cell responses start to kick in. And pathologists understand this extremely well. So what that means in terms of therapy is that early on, antivirals are a really good idea. And later, in people that have a hyperactive or exaggerated immune response, that perhaps immune modulators, be it general corticosteroids like dexamethasone, or perhaps tocilizumab, an IL-6 inhibitor, might be of benefit. And we indeed have seen that. But I think there's key point to clinicians is using an antiviral late doesn't do much. So most of our use of remdesivir is just on the cusp of where it might be effective, which is why we don't see a dramatic response. If we used remdesivir in the first day to day 3, we'd have a much better response, but it's 5 days of IV therapy, so not practical. Similarly, if you use dexamethasone here, which a lot of urgent care centers did, you screw up the innate immune response and you lead to prolonged illness and worse severity. So people that would go to urgent care, get tested on day 2, diagnosed positive, and on the way out the door, they give them a slug of steroids in their arm or their buttock, and they've just hurt the patient because that's the wrong thing to do biologically in those first 6 to 7 days. We do use monoclonal antibodies here. The earlier, the better, because it functions as an antiviral. And as we'll talk about in a second, molnupiravir, which will probably be approved mid-November, is an antiviral nucleoside analog. Think about it like you would Tamiflu for influenza. Got to use it early, but can work and reduce things dramatically. So here's a quick summary. Remdesivir, I've already made my comment about. The monoclonals here, bamlanivimab and others, we do use frequently. We've changed this now back to use because when the Delta variant came out, we weren't 100% sure whether it would be Delta or Delta Plus. Delta Plus may be bubbling somewhere but hadn't come out yet. Dex, as I said, don't use it early, but you should use it late if someone's in the hospital and hypoxic. And tocilizumab also can be beneficial, but it has a very narrow window of where it's useful. Molnupiravir is a nucleoside. It's a cytidine derivative. I won't go over the data. I'll just summarize by saying that in a placebo-controlled study released in press release a few weeks ago, it reduced symptoms and hospitalization by 50%. Not great. The monoclonal antibodies reduce by about 70 to 90% hospitalization and death. They didn't have a really good mortality outcome that they could quantify for molnupiravir, but they did see a dramatic reduction in hospitalizations of about 50%, if you want to call that dramatic. Not great. Got to give it early. Got to give it in the first 2 to 4 days. It's a twice daily drug given for 5 days, much like Tamiflu. The other thing that is under discussed but real is something called PASC, or it's basically called long COVID. And long COVID are persistent symptoms that last in people that had had COVID. A study in JAMA 2 weeks ago said 50% of people who had symptomatic COVID of any sort had persistent symptoms. Now, I think debilitating persistent symptoms is more like 8 to 10%, but that's still a lot of people. And so when people say, "Oh, I'm not going to worry about this. I don't want to take a vaccine, but I'll take molnupiravir and I'll take a monoclonal, but don't give me the vaccine because it's too experimental," right? I mean, these other drugs have much less clinical information, but they'll take that. But the fact is that even if you get monoclonal or even if you get molnupiravir, you still are at risk for developing long-term symptoms of COVID, where the vaccine will have a much better effect in preventing symptomatic disease and severe symptoms. If you guys can explain to me why people are anti-vaccine, I'm all ears, but I can't quite figure it out. Because to me, this COVID vaccine is like a deus ex machina in Greek tragedy. For those of you who remember that from high school or college, the protagonist would be in a tragedy and being almost killed, and then Zeus, as the god, would come in and rescue them out of the situation, usually with a machine, technically in the Greek theater, and that was called a deus ex machina. And that's what, to me, this vaccine was. Why do I say that? Well, because I had worked and been involved in developing an HIV vaccine for 35 years. We don't have one. And the day that the sequence was released on January 10th, 2020, by the Chinese government to the world, Tony Fauci went over across the street to the National Vaccine Research Center. They had been working on the concept of mRNA vaccines for HIV and other vaccines, like for Ebola. And they said, well, we know the sequence, we know the area of the spike protein. What if we take that, shuttle it into a vector for mRNA and develop a vaccine? They thought about it for about a day and a half and came up with a prototypic vaccine 2 days after the sequence was released, did parallel studies in animals, and then ultimately phase 1 dose finding, and that merged into phase 2 and phase 3. And this became the Moderna vaccine. Now, if that's not a miracle, I don't know what in the world is. So we didn't know if it actually would work. And sure enough, by November, the data from the phase 3 studies for Pfizer and Moderna started to mature. By the first part of December, the data were released. It was reviewed very thoroughly by the FDA and approved by mid-December. And most of us in healthcare settings were getting our vaccines right before Christmas. I call that a Christmas miracle, because we didn't know. You can design the vaccine, but we didn't know if it would work. And did it work? Yes. mRNA vaccines, I'm not going to go over details. I think this audience already understands that. But these are the data from, say, Pfizer, and this is after first dose The second dose would have been here. And the red line are those who got the Pfizer vaccine. The blue line is the placebo. And you don't need to be a statistician to understand that this vaccine worked in terms of symptomatic infection, hospitalization, and death dramatically. 92% protection against symptomatic infection initially, and nearly 100% protection, at least initially, against death, 99.2%. So we can't find vaccines that work a whole lot better than that. And as far as safety goes, it was comparable to the shingles vaccine, and maybe a little bit more local side effects than the flu vaccine, but a whole lot more effective than the flu vaccine. You see billboards on the street right now that say, COVID vaccines kill. Really? Really? Where are the data for that? Because it ain't happening. That's total nonsense. COVID kills. COVID vaccines do not kill. Full stop. Are there complications? Yeah, there are a few rare ones, like we saw the clotting disorder in the J&J in about 12 to 20 women, mostly under the age of 50, out of several million people who were dosed. We're not seeing deaths from COVID vaccine directly. We are not. And that's nonsense. As is fertility. What in the world? Where did that come from? Seriously. Think about the biology of an mRNA vaccine. You inject it into the muscle. Those of you who've done research in RNA in the lab know that it's not very hardy, right? The little RNAs breaks it up and it's gone. And there's plenty of RNases in the body, but you give it in a muscle, it starts to be translated into protein. That protein gets expressed on the surface of the muscle cell. The immune system responds, and then it's pretty much gone. How in the world do you go from here without even a DNA product to affect fertility? It just doesn't happen. But yet, Facebook, websites promote this, and people, I think, who have a political agenda and a reason, almost like you pull for Alabama or Auburn, their political filters lead them to embrace this and cause disinformation that we are fighting mightily right now. So the way I explain it to people and to patients is, look, is the vaccine risk-free? No, not at all. But its risks are so minimal that what you're weighing out here is the risk of getting a vaccine and having a problem, which is ridiculously small, or your risk of getting COVID, becoming sick and dying. I mean, which is worse? It's obvious. So here's real-world affirmation. I'm going to give you a couple slides here. In May, after the vaccines were released, there were 18,000 COVID deaths. 17,850 of those deaths were in unvaccinated people. In June, the numbers came down, same story. 99.2% protection against death. There are very few vaccines that do that. Flu vaccine doesn't do it that well. And in hospitalization, 98% of those admitted to the hospital in May and June were unvaccinated people. This came from the New York Times this morning. They tracked this. I'll talk about the Delta variant here, but before I do that, just notice the line of people who are vaccinated who get into the hospital versus those who, this is the top panel. And the bottom panel, so sixfold higher risk of being hospitalized if you're unvaccinated, and 12 times higher risk of death if you're not vaccinated. And it was even higher back in August. So is this a fundamental function of Delta? I don't think so. Yeah, Delta may be a little bit more virulent. We know it's more transmissible, but I don't think it's that much more virulent. I think what happened here is that the efficacy of the vaccine started to fade. It certainly faded for development of symptomatic infection. Very, very effective in the first 2 months, 3 months. At 4 and 5 months, the efficacy of antibodies started to drop. So symptomatic infection picked up. And in those people, especially who were immunocompromised, who didn't have as robust a response to vaccine in the first place, are the people pretty much in this lower bar who ended up getting hospitalized and ended up dying because the vaccine started to wane in terms of its full protection, which was 2 to 3 months after the initial after the initial series. Here's some data from September, just in our hospital, that reinforces everything I just said, not only in terms of hospitalized patients, but those in the ICU and those on ventilators. This is hard evidence. No one's making this up, despite the fact that a lot of us in the field are being accused of having some sort of agenda. I think I can speak for all of us and say our agenda is to save lives. Full stop. That's it. Yet, despite data, despite imploring, we're not doing so great. It's not showing up on my screen, the top of this, but basically, areas of the country along the coasts have done pretty well with vaccination. Bay Area, a couple of areas here, the area here in Texas. Alabama, not bad. Jefferson County, better than some rural areas. Madison County, doing better. But we have a ways to go, and we still got to keep pushing on this. This is what I was saying earlier. These are data from a Lancet article earlier this month. I actually wrote an editorial for this article that was published on the 15th. But what you're looking at here is the protection against symptomatic infection against Delta here, but then also against other variants. And you'll see that after about 2 to 3 months, it really starts to fade to only about 60% protection. And notice that it isn't Delta. It's Delta or any variant 3 to 6 months. But what was cool is that for the most part, despite the symptomatic infections breaking through, the actual protection against hospitalization and death was pretty well sustained. And that didn't matter what age people were, although if you broke it down by immunocompromised people, which they weren't able to do in their study, that's when you'll see the hospitalizations kicking up and the deaths tilting up a little bit. So what about the boosters? Well, because of data like this, it's recommended. For who? Anybody over the age of 65, anybody immunocompromised. And by the way, understand that in the next 2 or 3 months, I think we're going to see a 4th shot given to immunocompromised people. We'll stay tuned for that. Who have an underlying health condition, and we can play games with whatever that might be. To me, obesity might be an underlying health condition that should warrant a booster shot. Dr. Walensky, who's speaking at the Marquez conference next week for us, overruled the recommendation of the ACIP and added to this list first responders and healthcare workers. I personally agree with that, even though we're not necessarily at higher risk for our own health, but we're certainly getting exposed a whole lot more. And I think the additional protection is there. And I added this: anyone who received a single dose of J&J going up to about July of this year should get a second dose. And if you do, if you had J&J, definitely get Pfizer and Moderna. Those are data from, again, 2 weeks ago that showed mixing and matching of vaccines is actually a good idea. And those of you who think in terms of immunology, exposing to a little bit of a different epitope makes some sense. It gives you a little bit of a broader response on the clinical data from a really well-conducted NIH-sponsored trial that hasn't been peer-reviewed completely. It's on MedRx, which a lot of us are looking at these days. The data are pretty striking. But if you got J&J and you only had the 1 dose, go now, get your second shot, and make sure it's either Pfizer or Moderna. You'll get a much better boost in antibody. If you had Pfizer or Moderna series, my personal recommendation would be get the other one. Not critical. Both in that study from the NIH had pretty good response, but yeah. So both would work. I just like the idea of seeing a little bit of a different antigen. That seems to be a good idea from a biologic perspective. But if you do get the Moderna, for whatever reason, you had Moderna before, you get Moderna again, get the half dose, because the full dose isn't required for the antibody, for the immune system response, but it does have the full dose will have a higher side effect profile. So just, you don't need as much. And it's 50 micrograms. Remember, Pfizer's at 30 micrograms. And so what about kids? This week, review of the data. This came from the actual report that was sent from Pfizer to the FDA. And again, does this look familiar? Yeah, it's basically the same frickin' type of protection that we saw. Now, I think their dose is 10 micrograms instead of 30 for those kids aged 5 to 11. But notice again, fewer numbers of people overall. There were 40,000 people in the original Pfizer study. This is, I think, around 1,000 kids, maybe a little bit more. But you'll see that the group that got the vaccine were well protected against symptomatic infection, and those who didn't had more incident infection. So what to do after vaccination? I think for now, based on our numbers, I'd continue to wear a mask in public. I always do, partly because I think it reinforces those who aren't vaccinated that they should be doing that. Also because, frankly, there are paparazzi around who take my picture when I'm out, if I'm in public without a mask, swear to God, and they put it on Facebook, and I'm tired of that. Social distance, avoid large crowds for reasons that I went over, but I think as our numbers come down, we can relax. I think it's okay to travel if you're vaccinated. I'm not real excited about that. If I was not vaccinated, I wouldn't travel, but wear your mask on the plane. The planes are pretty safe. They recycle air, a full cycling of air exchange every 12 to 15 times per hour, which is remarkable. And it goes through a HEPA filter. But I don't think if you're outdoors or if you're in a small gathering around people you know to be fully vaccinated, you can get back to regular activities, a bridge group, a family get together. I'm still not a big fan of large church gatherings because, in my experience, up to 40% of people attending church have elected not to be vaccinated. So they're there, they go to that number. If you have 100 people in the room, even with our current transmission rates, out of that 100, it's about a 80%, 85% chance that 1 out of the 100, you got 300 people, then you're talking almost 100% likelihood that somebody in that congregation is infected and spewing virus like pigpen. They're not wearing a mask. It's going to be a super spreader event potentially. To give you a perspective here, this is what I can't help but be almost emotional about, is just to look at the deaths. Now, I grew up in the era of the Vietnam War. I've been to, like a lot of you, been to the Vietnam War Memorial. And you walk in and you're just overwhelmed by the number of people who died. 58,209 over a period of about almost 20 years. U.S. soldiers and advisors died. Korean War, not quite as many. The Gulf War, few number of casualties. I mean, for anyone who lost a family member there, it's powerful, but a small number compared to the other wars. And so the total number of deaths due to those wars combined was 101,000 people. COVID, we're now at 750,000 plus deaths in the matter of about 20 months. Here's World War I, World War II, even the Civil War, where both sides were Americans, right? Count up on our numbers. Why is that? And to me, especially over the last 8 months, 95+% of the deaths are preventable, were preventable. Shame on us, society-wise. Shame on us. The vaccines are provided free. They work. They're safe. And we as a society are making a, quote, choice not to use it. So I'm going to get to my editorial comment here in a minute, but we know what happened. I think what was done right was the science for the most part. What we've done wrong for the most part has been political. We are inundated with myths, beyond myths, lies, misinformation, wrong information that spreads like wildfire on the internet. And what's worse is that the people we would turn to guide us through this type of crisis, just like if we were attacked as a country from the outside by another country, we would expect our military to protect us, our generals and our soldiers. We'd respect them. We'd acknowledge their expertise and turn to them to guide us through this. Our response as a society to this epidemic is we have assassinated our trusted voices, who, when you look all along, that they made a misstatement? Sure. Was there a couple of miscalculations, especially early? Absolutely. But 99% of what they've told us is the truth. And the truth is another casualty of this war. And what does it mean for us as we go forward? We have such a disease in our country of mistrust and misinformation that I don't know how this ends or where it ends or if it ends. But it doesn't feel good to any of us right now. And COVID, our response to COVID, is yet another symptom of this disease that has cost hundreds of thousands of lives of people who died unnecessarily because of this disease in our society, where we don't trust one another. We need to get beyond that. It's killing us. So I'll pause there. I think I've left 15 minutes for questions. I deliberately was provocative. I deliberately was passionate because I think this requires passion. So I'll stop sharing my slides and I will return.
Thank you very much. Very powerful lecture, and thank you for the information and passion. So we have a few questions posted, and others who didn't post, feel free. We have plenty of time. So the first question is by Randy Crone. Mike, there may be some benefits of using targeted immune approach, IL-1 blockade, earlier than cortisons, as they may slow the hyper-inflammatory response without notably diminishing the antiviral response.
Yeah, I will never argue with Randy about anything immunologically. So yes, I agree. I was oversimplifying a bit because what I don't want to see is people using powerful immune modulators in the first several days, because I think that interferes with the ability to clear the virus. That's the main point.
Alan Bryan made a comment that worldwide fertility concerns have appeared for many vaccines regardless of mechanism or success rate. Then Dr. Duncan was asking about relationship to age, and you answered that in your graphs that in terms of whether younger adults, teen, and children will eventually need boosters.
Yeah, let me comment just about the disease. That is something else that was different about Delta that I didn't mention. for whatever reason, maybe it's because of higher viral load, maybe because of just more transmission in aggregate, that more kids got infected or more younger people. But we saw a definite shift of age of hospitalized people to much younger ages than we saw in the original epidemic. So the first, say, 10 to 12 months, and kids included. So somebody came up to me the other day and said, why are you pushing for vaccines in young kids of 5 to 11 years of age? Only, quote, only 500 have died nationwide so far. Only 500 have died.
Amazing.
One dying, in my view, is too many. 500? Come on.
Dr. Rosenblum is asking, what data do we have on those younger than 5 years old? Data on vaccination and such.
It's pending. Yeah, I'll give you some insight. I sort of talk to people behind the scenes like you guys do in your field. The data are right on the heels of the 5 to 11 years old. It looks identical. They're just waiting for enough time for safety to be fully assessed, so there's no surprise. You can imagine in the political environment, the social environment, that if we release things a little bit we got too far ahead of the data and something popped up unexpectedly, we would destroy our credibility. So they're being very careful about the measured release of these. I'd say by the first of the year, pretty much everyone over the age of 6 months will be getting a recommendation for vaccination.
And part of our question is, considering that babies cannot wear masks, would you travel by plane with one to a foreign country?
Oh boy, two issues with a foreign country. First off, the travel itself, getting there might be okay. Again, if Pigpen around the baby are wearing masks, which they are on the plane, I think and you got the air exchange. I'm not so worried about the plane. But when you get to the foreign country, there are two issues. One is we don't know the rate and we don't know the vaccination rates and we don't know the relative prevalence. So I get a little bit concerned, but I'm more concerned that if somebody gets infected overseas, you're stuck. You can't travel back. And whatever healthcare system environment you're in, it could be good, but it might not be good. That's what you got. So I would, until this gets under better global control, unless there was an imperative reason to go, I would stay.
Good advice. Dr. Saag, thank you for an excellent talk. That's from Kevin Harrod. What do you envision for the continued circulation of SARS-CoV, and do you think we will have annual, semi-annual vaccination going forward?
Love the question because it makes me quote Yogi Berra. Predictions are always difficult, especially when they involve the future. So my best guess, I think COVID is going to be with us for a decade at least, maybe longer. I think, therefore, we will find that we will get into a pattern of getting a booster. I would guess once a year, maybe a little bit more frequently, but I would say at least once a year. And so, to the people who are vaccine resistant or hesitant, you're going to end up getting vaccinated. Oh, one other thing I didn't say, this is important. There already are a number of people, obviously, who have been infected and recovered, and they will have immunity, right? But just like people who are vaccinated, that immunity wanes. So the best thing you can do if you had COVID like I did is to get vaccinated. You have the most robust immune response ever. It's perfect as immune responses get. And so I measured my neutralizing antibody before, right after I got tested. Marissa knows and others know that I was plasmapheresed and leukapheresed for science. Some of you may have used my plasma or cells, but my antibody levels started to wane by December after the booster, after the original shot. I call it a booster. Boom, some of the highest neutralizing antibody they've seen. And the breadth of the response not only included every variant known, it also covered SARS-CoV-1. I don't know how that happened, but it did.
A lot of praises from Jean-Francois Pité and Alan Bryan. Adam Wendy, Randy Crone added that those over 65 are more likely to be immunized. I think that was in the
True.
context of white kids and all that.
True.
One of our new faculty, Dr. Hanfei Ding, I have to say it's one of the best talks I've heard. Thank you, Dr. Saag.
Thank you.
Christina Crow, I heard the same quote from a family member about the travesty of saying only 500 died. Silvio Lutovsky, we have done autopsies on patients that were considered to be convalescent, but a PCR prior to a biopsy was positive. Autopsy was positive. What is the meaning of PCR positivity when clinically a patient is considered to be convalescent?
I don't know. My best guess is that it's remnant, not necessarily actively replicating virus. But it does raise a lot of questions that I think we collectively, especially you guys in pathology, but I think all of us, there's a lot that we still need to learn about this virus and especially the immune response to the virus. For example, why is it that people who get sick and end up in the ICU, the virus is pretty much cleared? You can still PCR, but it doesn't seem to be replicating. What's happened to Randy Crone's question that triggers such a hyper-aggressive immune response that doesn't get better? What happens? Why is that? Is there something about this virus that hijacks the immune response, or more specifically, hijacks the regulatory portion of the immune response that normally tells the troops to stand down? We got this now, but it doesn't seem to get that command, and it keeps raging. Where the immunomodulators are necessary, and sometimes even with that, people go on to die in an almost autoimmune or autophagic, that's probably the wrong word, but you get the picture. I don't know. But there is something, it goes back to Buffalo Springfield, the song For What It's Worth, that starts, there's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. I think that's where we are right now with a lot of COVID.
I knew that some songs are.
It's a great song.
Yeah, wonderful talk. That's from another new faculty, Girish Melkani. We, as a scientific and medical community, are 200% behind you. How we deliver the message to who only rely on political environment and social media.
We need immunomodulators against societal opinions. So, Randy, if you can work on that, I'd sure like to sprinkle it over society, have everybody chill.
Yes. Dr. McKinnon, it seems that the CDC performance throughout the pandemic has been inadequate, and the actions of local physicians and public health officials often a great risk to their career. Is what made the major difference in shaping policy and behavior. Do you agree, or what should be done to improve the CDC role?
Wow, I'm going to have to put a little filter on because the essence of what I have to say is I would agree. The CDC, especially initially, was erratic in its response, and it still suffers a little bit from that. But I think knowing Tony Fauci very well and hearing from the inside what was happening, everything that got released to the public had to be cleared through the White House. Anything, and it got redlined. So there was a throttle. If Tony Fauci got asked to be on a Sunday talk show, he had to get clearance to go on the talk show. And a lot of times it was refused, which ironically created opportunities for people like me, because I think people would rather hear from Tony Fauci, but he couldn't go on TV. So I would call it the politicalization. And it's not just the former administration. This administration is getting criticized for this, that, and the other as well. No administration's perfect, but along the way, we have assassinated the trusted voice, and we need to fix that because it's killing people. It really is.
Our director of autopsy service, Paul Benson, we've also had PCR positive autopsies on double vaccinated cases. Why?
Don't know.
Dr. Duncan, is there a relationship between how bad you feel after the vaccine and your levels of neutralizing antibodies?
Speaking first person, yes. I felt like crap after both vaccines. I've only had two, but my antibody response went through the roof afterwards. But I don't know the actual answer. Flipping it around, I know people who have not had much in the way of symptoms who had nice responses. So
Right. So, speaking of neutralizing antibodies, do you see ever a role for this, or we're just going to automatically do the boosters going forward? I mean, we went through the trouble of even offering that test. Now, diazoran, I know it doesn't have the dynamic range, and the other tests that you got, probably we gave you the better one, is too complicated to run on a daily basis.
yeah, no, the one I got was sent to Beatrice Hahn and George Shaw at Penn, and they did it in a meticulous research environment. So I don't know enough. You guys know about the commercially or the sort of
The diazoran, yes.
yeah the yeah. I no, I think policy wise it's a big mistake because it's chaotic enough. Um, I think just getting the booster and moving on would be smart.
I tend to agree, although you've been
It's a
better than
test you can.
everyone.
It's a test
But
you can run.
so Marissa Dr. Marquez, Mike, for the younger in the audience, so she's talking about us, you and me, I guess.
Uh-huh.
Could you compare the time course of COVID with that of HIV in the
Oh my
1980s?
God. Yeah. And yeah, no, yeah, very quickly. HIV syndrome defined in June of 81, ideologic agent identified March of 83. A test wasn't available until May of 85. The first treatment wasn't available until the summer of 87, 6 years.
Wow.
COVID, disease defined in late December, early January 2020, sequence released in January 10th, 2020, candidate vaccines 2 days after that, tests available almost immediately, although employed erratically in the US. Treatment, the first treatment available that actually worked by May of 2020, 4 months after the first cases, and a vaccine not only established, but shown to work within 11 months of the definitive description. I mean, amazing difference. But I will say that a lot of the science for COVID was built on the shoulders of what was done in the 80s and 90s and other viral infections, most notably HIV, but also Ebola and also hepatitis B and C. And so, yeah, that's why I say it was the best of times. The science is amazing. The worst of times is our political and social unrest.
Dr. Alan Bryan, I was on the initial planning committee prior to the first wave arrival. We were then anticipating CDC to produce a reliable test, and it was a shock when their effort failed. Has there been attention to make a more robust rapid response system inside or outside the CDC?
Yeah, there is. And there's a lot of, speaking of autopsies or postmortems, going on about the processes of what happened, what went well, but especially what didn't go well in testing was a good example of how things did not work well from CDC from mid-January to probably mid-April of 2020.
I love the next question from Dr. Robinson. Could you comment on the effect of ivermectin?
Yeah, it doesn't work. Um, I can go further,
Unless
but
you're a horse.
yeah, I mean, it worked. There's a test tube, if it showed it had a little bit of activity in vitro, and then that was extrapolated to a number of anecdotal reports that has flooded the literature, and it's all just terrible science. There was a large randomized study. I think it was somewhere doesn't matter of like 800 patients, and they retracted it after saying it worked great because the data were wrong. Even the company, this is the final comment, Merck, who makes the product, who would stand to make a lot of money if it did work, said don't use it. It doesn't work.
And the final question from our newest faculty, Yulong Fu. What is your comment for the COVID lab leak hypothesis?
Oh, possible, but not likely. So briefly, Wuhan lab had been doing SARS research, coronavirus research, since the original outbreak in 2003. Ironically, a lot of the information about the spike proteins and the interactions with ACE2 was contributed by the Wuhan lab over time, working with a guy at UNC named Ralph Barrick. So that's where some of our best data have come from, lifelong bat coronavirus researchers. So the one thought was that there was gain of function experiments where mutations were induced, and they ended up with a SARS-CoV-2 that was infectious. There was a breach of lab protocol in their BSL-3. A couple of researchers got infected, were taken to the local hospital, and that's how spread started. That was October, November of 2019, and that kicked off the whole epidemic. The counter to that is I think, a little bit more compelling, and that is when you look at the actual structure of the SARS-CoV-2 that first infected people in December 2019, the bat viruses that were being worked on in the Wuhan lab are not nearly homologous enough to explain how even a gain of function experiment would lead to this. And the other side of the coin is just look at the emergence of variants among the human populations, where we see the alpha, beta, gamma, alphabet soup of variants. That's in the course of about 18 to 20 months. The bats populations are heavily infected with SARS-type coronaviruses, and the concept theoretically of emerging a variant that would become infectious for humans, just like it did back with SARS originally and MERS, I think carries more weight. But I'll finish by saying that this would all be a whole lot easier if the Chinese government would allow a forensic investigation of the lab notebooks, just like we would do in the US if this question came up with a US lab.
Thank you very much. Since we have such a engaged audience, one thing that I've been trying, to explain to friends who keep saying messenger RNA. You mentioned 2 days, and some people saying, it's not 6 months. It's not the trial. The Lasker Award was given, it's Lasker DeBakey now, to Caitlin Carrico and Drew Wiseman, who really worked on this technology 10 years ago or over.
That's right.
So, yeah. So things have not been cooked that fast.
No, it's like everything else in science. We're built on the shoulders of the giants who came before us.
Correct. So we had 78 very engaged audience. We couldn't had a more exciting and informative round. Thank you very much, Dr. Saag.
Thank you for having me. Good seeing everybody.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye.